Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani stated on Wednesday that the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, also more commonly known as the Iran Nuclear Agreement, can still be temporarily saved if the United States allows Iran to take advantage of a $15 billion credit line from the European Union, as was proposed by France's President Emmanuel Macron. In the meantime, Rouhani also said that Iran will engage in a third violation of the JCPOA, which involves restarting nuclear research and development and the production of centrifuges for increased uranium enrichment.
I announce the third step now. Our Atomic Energy Organization is obliged to immediately start doing whatever technically required in the country in terms of research and development, and to abandon all commitments in terms of research and development under the JCPOA. We will witness development in research and development in the field of centrifuges, various types of new centrifuges, and whatever we need for enrichment, which will be handled by our Atomic Energy Organization, and we will observe promptitude in this regard.
In the last few weeks, Iran has tried to reach out to the U.S. through diplomatic channels. Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif even came to the G7 summit in France last month to try to meet with Trump. He later said, however, that Iran would not negotiate with the U.S. unless sanctions are lifted first. In a related development, Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, made a surprise visit to London on Thursday to meet with Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson. According to news reports of the visit, Netanyahu's purpose was to convince Johnson to reject France's proposal for a $15 billion credit line to Iran. Joining me now to discuss the latest developments with the Iran nuclear deal is Patrick Cockburn. He is an award-winning journalist and longtime correspondent for the British newspaper The Independent. His most recent book is The Age of Jihad. Thanks for joining us again, Patrick.
Thank you.
So what do you make of these recent developments, the announcement that Iran will engage in this third step of violating the JCPOA and the possibility of a $15 billion credit line to ease the U.S. sanctions against Iran? Is there any chance that the Europeans, mainly France, Germany, and the UK, could still save the JCPOA nuclear agreement?
I'm a bit doubtful about it. They have done a certain amount. This offer of a $15 billion credit line to make up for the loss of Iranian oil revenue was a French idea originally, but they're asking Iran to step right back into the old nuclear deal. But the Iranians are not likely to do that while they're subject to U.S. sanctions. And U.S. sanctions and the sanctioning of European companies or banks that deal with Iran basically means that Iraq is facing an economic siege. So these are maneuvers. The Iranians want to show they're being kind of moderate. They want to preserve this deal as they do. At the same time, they don't want to look as though they're pushovers, that sanctions are squeezing them to death and they've got no alternative but to give up. This would be to surrender to what Trump calls the policy of maximum pressure. So I think we're a long way from any real agreement on this. It's still escalating.
Now, Iran also just recently announced that it is releasing 7 of the 23 crew members it is holding of a Swedish-owned but British-registered tanker that Iran had seized last July. Now, Iran's Revolutionary Guard seized that tanker in retaliation for the British seizing an Iranian tanker near Gibraltar in early July. But the Iranian tanker has now been released. Now, how do you see the situation of these tankers evolving? Could such seizures of oil tankers eventually lead to an escalation and to even war?
Yes, they could. This is sort of a game of chicken. As you said, it started off on the 4th of July when the British rather melodramatically dropped 30 Royal Marine commandos on the deck of this vessel, saying it was heading for Syria. This had nothing to do with sanctions on Iran, but was a breach of sanctions on Syria imposed by the EU. this never sounded right because, it's a peculiar moment for Britain to suddenly put such energy into enforcing EU sanctions when we all know that Britain is trying to leave the EU at the moment. There's a great political crisis here in Britain about this. So this looked as though it was on the initiative of Washington. Then, as was inevitable, the Iranians retaliated against British-flagged vessels in the Gulf. There was an escalation. That seems to have died down at the moment. As I see it, the Iranian policy is to maintain pressure by sort of pinprick attacks. There was some small mines placed on oil tankers off the United Arab Emirates. Then we had the shooting down of the American drone. A whole series of events to show that they're not frightened, that they can retaliate, but not bring it up to the level of war. That's sort of the way the Iranians often react to this sort of thing, with some covert military measures and to create an atmosphere of crisis, but not bring a war about. But of course, once you start doing this, it could slip over, the edge of the cliff at any moment. The Iranians sort of did a sort of mirror image of the British takeover of their tanker. When they took over the British tanker, crew from which have just been released, as you mentioned, they dropped 30 commandos on the deck. There was a British naval vessel not so far away, not far enough to stop this. But let's say that naval vessel being closer. Would they have opened fire on a helicopter dropping these 30 Iranian commandos on the boat? That, would have been a war and could have very rapidly escalated. So we're always as I said, on the edge of the cliff in the Gulf, with each side sort of daring the other to go further.
Mm. Now, Iran says that the Europeans have 2 months to save the nuclear agreement, but Iran's economy and its people are suffering tremendously under the U.S. economic sanctions. The Europeans don't seem to be able or willing to do all that much to avoid these sanctions or to help Iran overcome them, it seems, despite a barter agreement that they tried to initiate. Now, what happens if the JCPOA completely falls apart? That is, if this 2-month deadline that Rouhani had set is missed, basically?
Well, it's falling apart by inches. But, there's still quite a long way to go on that. I think the one thing that has emerged is that the U.S., Trump, and Iran don't want war. At one time, the U.S. Was calling, or some of its senior officials were calling for a regime change. How far did they really believe this? When Trump decided not to retaliate for the drone being shot down, that shows that he wants to rely on sanctions, on this sort of very intense economic siege of Iran. But I don't think the Iranians are going to come running. Once they know there isn't going to be an all-out war, they'll try to sustain these sanctions. And the situation isn't quite as desperate as it looks. I mean, obviously, they're suffering a lot. On the other hand, they're not isolated. China and Russia give them a measure of support. The EU says rather pathetically, says it's trying to maintain the nuclear deal of 2015. But it's rather underlining the political military weakness of the EU that they haven't been able to do much about it. Big companies are too frightened of U.S. sanctions against them if they have any relations with Iran. So the Europeans aren't coming well out of it. Obviously, their relations with Trump are pretty frosty. They also probably don't think it's worth a really big crisis between the EU and the European states and America on this issue. but they are looking pretty feeble at the moment.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there for now, but as always, we're going to continue to follow this situation. I was talking to Patrick Cockburn, longtime Middle East correspondent with The Independent. Thanks again, Patrick, for having joined us today.
Oh, thank you very much.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.